The reason why Bear is getting so much grace from a lot of men is because a lot of men are like Bear. And
Fucking oath. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
for those who don't know, Goon World is my Nebula original that is a deep dive into the various aspects of pornography, sex, and sex work. And the second episode looks at the complicated world of porn usage for men.
I will say, FD, if you ever want to have me on for a candid conversation with a trans sex worker who focuses on basically intersections of class, culture, and race between gender nonconforming people, non-white people, BIPOC people more broadly, and various other struggles, I'm here.
Topic that every male watching this likely knows something about, but nobody wants to talk about with any sense of honesty or sincerity. Or
I do. I do. Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to respond to FD Signifiers, Your Obsession Takes Are Bad, because you are bad. And I'm doing that after having responded initially to Bear is Evil But. So Bear is Evil But, they give their basic analysis of the film in ways where they make a lot of good points, but they fail to stress something that I think is quite important, which they actually say here in this video.
Bear is not the person to flesh out the experiences of men being abused because Bear is an abuser. Bear isn't a victim of Nicky's behavior because he is responsible for Nicky's behavior. And
Just that. Bear is not a victim of Nicky's behavior because he is responsible for said behavior. And this is something that FD mentions in this follow-up video to their initial response, where in their initial response, I felt like they could have stressed that a bit more, and they spent a bit of time, more time than I felt comfortable, essentially sort of apologizing for Bear, admittedly in a for the sake of argument kind of way. They weren't advocating for abusive behavior, but they were also they were using different language that I didn't feel comfortable with, such as dubious consent, in ways that were kind of overlooking the fact and not really highlighting that Bear was responsible for Nicky's behavior by virtue of having caused it in a very direct and harmful way. So while they ultimately said a lot of things that I agreed with in this video, Bear is Evil But, because they didn't stress the fact that the rape starts with the spell, which takes away Nicky's ability to consent. And they didn't really lead off with that. And they don't mention it or stress it nearly enough in their initial response, which led me to make this video, Rape Culture and Obsession and Those Who Defend It. All of that being said, they lead off relatively early in this video saying basically what I wanted to hear from the outset, which is Bear is not a victim, he's an abuser because he's responsible for Nicky's behavior, having caused it. So, all of that being said, I would like to watch the entirety of this video by Signifier and give my updated thoughts and feelings, knowing that they stress an argument that I find incredibly important, which is identifying who the abuser is and where the rape is occurring. So all of that being said, I'm just going to go through this video start to finish and give you my thoughts. Before we get started, I also want to say that this recording will constitute as part of my upcoming book volume, Volume 6, Intersectionality. What Dreams May Come is a blog-style book promotion for Volume 6, the Intersection volume. It belongs to my larger book series, Gothic Communism, whose one-page promo contains the PDF versions for download, offline consumption. The promotion here is meant for easy public viewing and citation, giving the same contents online in single post form. The covers, abstract, table of contents, and summaries per entry, they are hyperlinks. So this video where I talk about FD Signifier's follow-up response to Obsession will be included as part of Volume 6 overall, which at the moment is only online as part of an online book promotion that is a work in progress. Specifically, the Intersection volume continues my book series on a limited basis. i.e. while writing mostly on WordPress in small form content, responding to other content creators online, essays, blog posts, and interviews of different kinds. It mostly expands my work on state predation, countering its raping of nature and those of nature under Cartesian thought for productivity and profit, under capitalist realism, through various forms of intersectionality among BIPOC, GNC, disabled and/or furry, etc. sex workers alongside non-sex workers, e.g. interracial sex and/or social exchanges through subversive Gothic poetics, the dehumanizing language of monsters to reclaim and humanize ourselves with. Diversity is the point. And this includes different sex workers, but also non-sex workers, such as Cam James and Squid Tips. All of these people I interview together as part of a larger series. If you're interested in the work that I do, you can not only check out this video, but you can check out my interviews with Squid Tips, Cam James, and other people that I have planned to interview as well. Lastly, this is the information about me and my book series overall. So if you're curious, I will have various links in the description of this video, or you can find out even more. But the most basic information is included in this footer that I will let you, should you choose, pause the screen now so you can read a little bit more about me than we have time to go into. All right, with all of that being said, I am going to watch this from start to finish. I'll be pausing it intermittently to just give you my basic thoughts and feelings.
All right, I saw Obsession. The script says a month ago. I really wrote this script like a month ago. I've been busy, but like it is what it is. But yeah, so even though it came out a while ago and I saw it a while ago, still in my mind, still got things I want to say, and that's what basically this video is going to be. I do want to just point out, really enjoyed the film. I don't like horror movies. I don't like being scared for fun. It's not my thing. As anyone who watched me play Resident Evil a couple of months ago can tell you. Oh, this is a dead end.
I remember watching a bit of that footage. It was fun to watch just because you clearly were not always enjoying yourself while playing the game. I mean, maybe overall you liked it, but when you got scared, it seemed like you were genuinely uncomfortable.
Oh. I feel like there's like several games I started and posted on the gaming channel that I have not touched in a while, but I've been busy. I've been doing side quests and still more shit to go. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about with Obsession. It's made by a YouTuber, triggering what seems to be a recurring conversation in Hollywood about how is this the new way for studios to find talent, when in actuality they've been bringing people from YouTube into Hollywood for over a decade at this point. Bo Burnham is one of them. Zach Cregger, who directed Weapons, probably the last good horror movie I watched, is from YouTube. Oh,
I remember the director for It Follows. I want to say that they started off doing a short film variant of that before it became a larger studio production. I could be misremembering that, but thereabouts in the mid 2010s when that film got made, I think it was based initially off some short films that they shared online. And FD is absolutely correct insofar as using YouTube as a funnel into Hollywood, various talent that the ruling class can basically milk for content because they're creatively bankrupt and they have to steal everything from elsewhere. And YouTube is just another means for them to do so.
also, like a bunch of Black people have already done this. Morgan Cooper, who did that really dope Bel Air pilot, got him a whole Bel Air show on Paramount. And of course, Issa Rae and Donald Glover are probably the first people, or one of the first people, to do this. It's not a big deal, by the way, since, you know, we're grabbing people from YouTube to Hollywood. Hollywood, come get me before, you know, you're running out of time. One thing that I haven't heard enough people talk about with this movie is that it's like the first like big monoculture thing for Gen Z since maybe Five Nights at Freddy, when most of y'all were children.
Freddy, you're supposed to be on lockdown.
Vanessa.
And this is not to say that we haven't had big cultural events like, you know, Sinners a couple of years ago or whatever.
I feel like with Sinners, it wasn't really aimed at Gen Z. Whereas Bear as a character is about the age of young men, and Nicky about the age of young women who would be dating as Gen Z specifically. So this movie has people of the Gen Z generation who are predominantly its stars. There's almost no characters who are millennials in this film, as far as I can tell. And like you said, the director, oh, what's his name? Um, I'm blanking on the name of the director. Coop and Carpenter and Coop, I think. Curry Baker, Curry Barker, Curry and Coop. I think they're both Gen Z as well. Whereas Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan and some of the other actors from Sinners, a lot of them are millennials or from older generations than that. So yeah, that's definitely important to recognize. Is this is like the first big horror film for Gen Z, I think.
But this one is uniquely Gen Z, starring Gen Z actors, directed by a Gen Z director, etc. And I kind of love that for y'all. It's a little weird. It's a little weird because I think my version of this as a millennial was Scream. And when you look at Scream, it's so fun and a little over the top and maybe a little oversexed. And
I mean, that's just the Gothic in a nutshell. The Gothic, more broadly, is largely concerned with the tall, dark strangers, specifically the rapist, through mutilative, penetrative violence, a fear of the imposter, the perceived outsider that actually comes from within. The call is coming from inside the house. That meme can be attributed to Scream specifically and just older stories more broadly. Um, so it's not super unusual. And it goes back to Halloween, He Knows You're Alone, and similar stories where the white babysitter is tormented by someone inside the house who is killing her friends, her lookalikes within the same community that torment her, a la the Duchess of Malfi, going back to the Renaissance period. And the late Renaissance period with John Webster, I forget the exact date, but with the Duchess of Malfi, it's the same basic idea, tormenting the privileged woman who still lacks a certain amount of agency. So this isn't really anything new. This is centuries old at this point, and saying that something, specifically the Gothic, is oversexed, that's just the Gothic.
probably a little problematic, but in general,
Also the Gothic.
like it speaks to a sense of optimism about the world, despite the fact that it's a horror movie. And Obsession,
That's often how horror works. It's not strictly a condemnation of things within society, but an exploration of problematic things within society through a taboo framework and its poetics, specifically rape play, to allow us to navigate the proceedings and find our way out of confusion, or work within confusion to establish some sense of resolution, however imperfect.
just feels really dark and depressing. Uh,
It's called being a woman. It's the reality. Women have to face, is this person going to rape me? Is this person going to murder me? You know, that's just how that works.
I don't know what to tell y'all about that, but I hope y'all work that out. But of course, the real reason to dive into this topic is because of the gender politics of the movie and the discourse surrounding it, something that shouldn't be surprising, but sadly still is to an extent.
I will say that there is a sense of optimism with Obsession in my mind, because eventually the heroine escapes with some collateral damage, unfortunately, but she defeats the abuser in this situation. She survives. And rape victims, our victory as survivors is just that, survival. So that's the optimistic thing. You know, the reality is, yeah, we get abused, but yeah, we overcome that in ways that ultimately hoist the abuser on his own petard.
I always know there'll be poor readings of complex media because people just don't have great media literacy, but it always gets even worse when gender comes into it, especially when it's white masculinity in particular, because it's really hard for people to engage with white manhood and white masculinity without doing really, I think, exactly what we're doing with Obsession. And even though I've talked about masculinity in general so much, I'm still shocked by how badly some men, white and otherwise, are engaging with an analysis of Bear, the male everyman protagonist, who I argue is probably one of the most important portrayals of masculinity we've seen in a while.
I want to say too that this stems from a lack of understanding that springs itself from childhood, where they know what they're taught. Sexism is taught, misogyny is taught from an early age. What Mark Green et al. Would call the man box. And from an early age, we're taught that cherchez la femme is normal. There's a gender hierarchy that places women beneath men and is obviously tied to capitalism, neoliberalism, fascism, where a gender hierarchy within the state as heteronormative, this is all taught to us from an early age. And anything that sort of butts up against that is generally met with violence. Incidentally, I was watching someone critique American History X, saying the film isn't as relevant as it could be in this day and age because it doesn't push back diegetically against fascism. And it just sort of presents it a priori as something to inherently disagree with, instead of recognizing that many members of the audience could look at Edward Norton curb stomping the black guy and basically say, good job, Edward Norton, you're taking care of business. They agree with the premise that you're not supposed to agree with a priori. And the reality with Bear and how people look at him, it's the same idea. They agree and side with Bear in a problematic way a priori.
And it shows in how poorly he's being understood by a variety of people. So as a professional overthinker about media, I feel the need to come in, and I'm not going to say correct the record on Bear because my take is just my take, but I do want to at least give people a perspective that I haven't seen, but it might be because I was busy doing other shit, which is why this video is so late. But watch it anyway. I promise you it's going to be pretty. First, before we dive into who Bear really is, I do want to acknowledge some of the, I'll say, good faith but incorrect readings of him that I've seen that at least deserve some discussion. For example, if you ignore the reality of his situation and his behavior, then you could make the argument that Bear's experience is what it feels like for a straight man to be on the receiving end of a toxic, abusive, and codependent relationship. I know this because in between the, again, clear indicators of who is in the wrong here, I did recognize some familiar feelings based on my past experiences with emotionally abusive or codependent girlfriends. And the fact that I could have that reaction is, to me, partly what makes the movie so well written. It purposely illustrates these struggles and how they look and feel, and situates us, the viewer, in the perspective of Bear specifically, as if he isn't the reason why this behavior is happening.
Exactly. And when I was watching Obsession, I remember thinking, just as like a gut feeling, even though I knew, okay, Bear is obviously the rapist, he's the rapist from the outset. And when he's just being creepy and weird for like the first 5 to 10 minutes, he casts the magic spell, he takes away Nicky's agency, and then from then on out, it's just straight abuse. I still felt reminded of codependent and or abusive situations with past female partners that I was with, gender non-conforming female partners, non-binary, gender fluid, what have you, trans mask, who would be abusive towards me in different ways. My rapist, Lindsay Wheeler, was someone who, was a woman and had control over me in ways that I felt myself making comparisons to what was happening with Bear and Nicky, even though it's not a direct comparison. It's, strictly speaking, a metaphor. It's a comparison between two unlike things that had some degree of similarity, even if ultimately the abuse was inverted from a gender standpoint. So I found myself doing kind of the same thing as a rape survivor myself, and having dealt with codependent partners. Just at a glance, if you forget the reality of what Bear is, you can make those comparisons. And even if you don't forget, you still can make those comparisons.
and doesn't outright show us immediately or consistently that it's his fault that is happening. The movie will show us the evidence of Bear being an awful guy a few times, but it does it in a way that purposely allows Bear and thus us, the viewer, to have some plausible deniability. And over the course of the film, it slowly removes that deniability so that you hopefully notice what's happening.
You can notice also, however, that just because there's room for plausible deniability, some people never go through the process of acknowledging anything beyond what proves their arguments a priori. They're going to agree with Bear no matter what because he's a white man. He represents who they are within society, and they would never want to challenge that position. So, despite the fact that the movie slowly removes that plausible deniability, diegetically, these problematic viewers, don't acknowledge that aspect. They ignore that part of the evidence. The horror's testimony is basically buried for them, and all they care about is exonerating someone that they know is guilty. And in the Malcolm X video that I referred to earlier, plenty of fascists and liberals are inconsistent and hypocritical in their beliefs. They don't even necessarily believe in them. All they care about is power. So when people defend Bear, it would be the same kind of people who defend Edward Norton and that kind of behavior more broadly. They care about the defense of a position within society that allows them certain privileges, including the ability to prey on others. That's what they care about. It's not, you can't really reason with them insofar as they know what they're saying is wrong. They just don't care. That's not everyone that Signifier is referring to, of course, but it makes up a large number, I would argue. There are plenty of guys that, and women for that matter, just people who will apologize for rape more broadly. Plenty of rape victims will apologize for rapists. When I was living under the same roof as my rapist, apologized for their behavior. I was gaslit, and gay-capped, girl-bossed kind of thing, and eventually I got away and stopped apologizing for it and found myself, when the ground beneath my feet was no longer eggshells, comfortable enough to talk about it. But yeah, people with more privilege will essentially apologize for Bear by virtue of the fact that he represents what they want, which is a position to abuse others. They want to be Bear and abuse someone like Nicky in a very comparable way. They're bad actors.
Some people don't, a lot of people don't. And for some of those who don't, what they get stuck on is how Bear's being treated and not on how Bear's creating the situation for how he's being treated. The problem is that a lot of men fail to recognize Bear's villainous behavior because it would force them to see that behavior in themselves. And we'll come back to that. But I do see why they lose track of things. There's a lot of misdirection, giving you the opportunity to come out of that headspace.
It's an easy out. Oh, well, there's plausible deniability. But again, as critical thinkers, you have to be able to look past those easy outs and actually bear some sense of responsibility, if not through your own direct actions, through the position that you occupy within society.
And this is especially likely for people who are conditioned to give a lot of grace to other straight white men, which societally speaking, we all tend to do. That is how white
Not me.
supremacy and patriarchy works. We are trained to give a lot of grace and make excuses for men who look and act like Bear. And you see that in,
Again, not me. And I know what you're saying, we as in a larger straight audience, white or otherwise. But as a trans woman, I learned from a very early age from my father, my stepfather, and other male authority figures, no, I'm not going to give grace to that. But again, it wasn't even so much that I was taught that. I mean, I was abused constantly, but my decision not to afford them grace largely stems from me being neurodivergent, which is congenital. So it's kind of a nature nurture sort of thing, but I understand what you're saying.
the greater discourse. And then you add to that Nicky doing horrible shit with the cat, Nicky freaking out in public, and you see Bear pleading with her to just be normal, and you might be remiss to think, oh man, I feel bad for that guy. He doesn't.
I didn't. Fuck that guy.
deserve this. He does. But, you know, Indy Navarrete, the actress that played Nicky, did an amazing job. And people talk about the freaky stuff and the walking backwards and the cat behavior and whatnot. But one
Essentially, from a psychological standpoint, what they would call hysteria, wandering womb, bicycle face. Look that one up. It's funny. But the mad woman in the attic, a trope that goes all the way back to Jane Eyre and various other stories where female madness isn't just something to diagnose, but it's a form of testimony where the mad woman, the witch, the horror is testifying to her abuse by existing in public in ways that give voice or rise to that. And Bear only cares about having Nicky as arm candy and as a sex object for him to exploit at home, but doesn't want the spell that is obviously imperfect. It's designed in ways to basically expose him. That's the nature of this particular Faustian bargain. The longer the spell goes on, the more he runs the risk of being exposed as an abuser, because by casting the spell at all, that's precisely what he's done.
thing I think is really key is how childish she behaves. And when she's in Ghost Nicky mode, she throws tantrums when she doesn't get her way. She expects Bear to excuse her antisocial and erratic behavior because she can't help herself, and she acts this way because she loves him so much. So it's his responsibility to deal with the feelings that she has because of him. Outside of the context of the movie, this is what codependency and abuse often looks like. And within the context of the movie, this is what gaslighting and abuse can look like. The way he lies to hide what she's doing, to lie about what he's going through, to make excuses for her, as opposed to facing the problem, is, again, in a different context, the way that men deal with situations where they're embarrassed or afraid because of what they're going through, because as men, we're not taught to see ourselves as being capable of being victimized by women. And again, having been in that situation, it was, I won't say triggering, but like illuminating to see it done on screen, partly because I don't think anybody's ever seriously done that in film, or at least any film that I've paid attention to. Part of me hopes that someone comes and tries to actually explore that sincerely and not as like the bait and switch thing it was in the, because that deserves to be more fleshed out. But I just want to be clear, Bear is not the person to flesh out the experiences of men being abused, because Bear is an abuser. Bear isn't a victim of Nicky's behavior because he is responsible for Nicky's behavior.
Exactly. And he essentially lobotomizes Nicky and treats her the same way that he treated the cat. And he's angry at the cat because the cat, you can hear him at the start of the film saying, "Why won't you love me?" And his mother dies. He's unable to take care of his mother, presumably. And the cat dies. And then Nicky comes along. And the first thing she does is she feeds him the dead cat that he killed, literally giving him a taste of his own medicine, which he later takes in pill form.
And the fact that this isn't as universally understood as it should be is troublesome and frustrating, but again, not surprising.
It's the Black Mirror, right? These kinds of stories prevent a sympathy for the devil, and the devil not just being Bear, but also Nicky, right? Because Ghost Nicky, as you point out, the ghost, the specter, the horror, they're all kind of occupying the same twilight zone, and readers will respond to that in ways that illuminate, based on their reactions, a testimony, a reaction to the story in ways that expose, once scratched, how they bleed in ways that they might not normally reveal. And that's sort of how the Gothic works. You present a rape narrative and you watch how people respond to its testimony.
Let me get one more thing out the way that at this point I don't think I need to actually deal with, but I just want to put it on a record just real quick. No, Bear does not become the villain at the moment of the wish. That was a take that I saw early when the movie was really popular from people that
I will say that just because he rapes Nicky at that point by taking away her agency and lobotomizing her, essentially, it is possible to violate someone's consent in a way that isn't like cartoonishly evil. And I think at this moment in time, you could realistically make an argument that he's not doing it because he consciously wants to rape her. Like, he thinks, I'll cast this spell, abracadabra, I'll have a girlfriend. That's probably the most amount of thought he put into it. It is tied to a larger pattern of abuse vis-a-vis the cat, but it's like serial killers, right? You're graduating from non-human animals to humans. And in his graduation moment where he basically takes part in the Faustian bargain, he isn't like cartoonishly aware as a villain, a gothic villain. Ha ha ha, I'm doing this and I'm so evil. But it is possible for people who aren't overtly villainous in a gothic way to rape people. It happens. And despite the fact that him not being a gothic villain does not preclude rape, is what I would point out.
I think just wanted to get their hot takes out in the comment section. And I don't think it's an opinion that's widely shared at this point. So I'm going to just not spend a lot of time there. But no, that makes no sense. And that's stupid. And you're stupid for thinking that. And we're just going to move on. Trying to make Bear this
That was an argument he made in the previous video.
Obviously and demonstrably evil character, evil villain in the film. I get why people are doing that. I think that take emerges because people want really simple and clear villains.
I'll say in regards to that there are no perfect villains, or rather no perfect victims or abusers. When I was raped, I had ignored various red flags and found myself in a situation where someone had total financial control of me in the middle of COVID. And this was something that I overlooked, I ignored. I wanted to get away from where I was and found myself on the receiving end of abuse. And the person who was abusing me was someone who had been abused themselves. And there were various moments where that side of them would come out, and I could tell that they weren't like 100% pure evil. It's not that simple, because if it was, they never would have been able to seduce me. There was something positive about them that I enjoyed, the same way that Bear, as the movie starts off, despite the fact that he has a creepy, obsessive side, is also someone who can be outwardly charming and is able to win the trust of Nicky in ways that I think aren't entirely false. He does have a side of himself that is relatively charming, that goes to show that he's not this cartoonishly evil 100% kind of villain. But I will say that he very quickly proves that that doesn't matter, because the side of himself, there are white wolves and black wolves inside us, or good wolves and evil wolves. Which one wins? The one that you feed. And he feeds that dark side of himself that after he rapes Nicky initially, he keeps doing it in ways that demonstrate his villainy through his actions. Not some essential character, not even just him being awkward and creepy and weird, as the film establishes up front, but as it continues to unfold.
And to make it seem as if Bear is evil just for erroneously and like non-seriously making that wish, you get this.
He was seriously making the wish, though, I would argue. Like, what kind of jackass goes to the store, buys a wishing wand, and then breaks it? These stories speak to deeply held beliefs or desires. He believes he is entitled to a girlfriend. Like, he very obviously believed in that. Even if, like, on some level he thought it was silly and stupid, in a moment of weakness, a moment of a lapse in judgment, he actually casts the spell. And what kind of person would, like, when he does that, he's desperate, and he is unable to just tell her that he has feelings for her. So instead he enacts this wish as a way of basically abdicating his responsibility. That is a pretty serious thing. Like, it's not something that he just does willy-nilly. He's not like, oh, this is stupid. Like, when he does it, he's like, oh boy, I really hope this works.
Simplify everything else after that. And while I get why people might want to do that, overly simplifying Bear's behavior to just make it evil is a good way to make sure nobody actually learns anything from this character.
But again, you're blaming other people who are interpreting the character, when really you just have to consider that the people who are making these decisions are operating based off things that they were exposed to long before these YouTube critics. You can't just say, oh, well, someone else made an interpretation and that's dumb. And that's why these people are making the interpretations that they do. When in reality, I would argue, actually, no, it's larger canonical forces at work dialectically materially vis-a-vis the state is white, straight, and male, Cartesian, heteronormative, and settler colonial. The man box. These are things that are exposed to people at a much earlier age. So by the time they saw this movie, their minds were already made up about this kind of shit. So you can't just pin it on some dumb interpretations. Just because someone else has a simple interpretation of bear, I would argue that the bear is evil by virtue of the things that he does, and he is a creepy weirdo, and he does believe in the spell. I will say that his the value judgments that we can assign to him more aggressively do stem after he makes the wish, where I don't think he anticipated that it would work to the degree that it did. I would agree with you there. And yet he represents someone who would rather make a wish like that and continue to uphold that kind of wish in ways that reflect through the actions of the people who are making these bad faith interpretations from the start. And I don't really mean to belabor this, but I want it to be understood that ultimately we're critiquing not just readers and their views, but what Marx would call the superstructure. And the superstructure is something that is larger than life. It is an undercurrent of media that is going to shape how you think in ways that are much broader than a single film or the people talking about it.
And from the way he moves within the film. People are so stuck on the fact that Bear is evil for how he did the wish that they don't even really start thinking about what he did right after the wish in that very same night in the next couple of scenes.
I would agree, absolutely. You want to examine his behavior after the wish, because the wish is something that is largely symbolic anyways, but, it's a thought experiment within the film. What if this could actually happen? What if it could come true? But his behavior that illustrates how evil he is has to do with how he reacts in that situation. If he was really so selfless, he would kill himself, right? Well, you could always kill yourself, as the devil says in the movie. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But even when Nicky asks him to kill her, he won't do it because he exposes to us after the wish that that's what he really cares about vis-a-vis the cat, vis-a-vis his mother.
The way Bear behaves this night, to me, the way Bear behaves the night right after he makes the wish and Nicky's behavior starts to change is the most interesting and the most important aspect of recognizing why he's bad and why many viewers struggle to see him bad or struggle to see his badness accurate. And that's because on that night, if you understand the way issues around consent work and how men are trying to respond to consent, he technically did everything right. Just to remind everyone of this night's events, they go out, Bear drives Nicky home. He's trying to work up the courage to express his feelings. He chickens out, and then out of frustration, he makes the wish. Again, not knowing the wish was actually going to work, not having any idea or belief that that was the case. And pretty much immediately, Nicky changes. We know now that what really happened is that Nicky's consciousness gets replaced or trapped in some other dimension while her body is taken over by what I believe people are calling Wish Nicky, which again is horrifying and we'll get there. But remember,
it's a doppelganger. And I always envision this. There are different ways you can interpret this. It could be Bear's dark desire. It could also be Nicky's dark desire, an avenger, a castrator, the monstrous feminine. It's the witch, the succubus. So it doesn't explicitly have one definition or one set meaning. It's an ink blot, essentially, mid-abjection.
Bear doesn't know this and has no reason to think this is the case. And here's where it gets weird, because Wish Nicky, if we're honest and just looking at this scene objectively, low-key finesses Bear into bed. She immediately takes on...
Yes. So stemming to my analysis of this film vis-a-vis Matthew Lewis's The Monk, she is Rosario / Matilda / the devil. She is tempting Bear because that's ultimately Bear wants someone to do the tempting for him, the dominatrix. And So these choices are again made from someone who again represents Bear's idea of what he wants on some level. He's the white, straight-laced guy with a lot of boundaries who has difficulties, a lot of barriers to communication, rather, that make it difficult for him to communicate. And he wants someone to do all of the work for him. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of sex workers, a lot of dominatrixes, however it's sort of constructed, presented, framed, and executed, are generally working through a power imbalance that favors the man. The sex worker is generally at a disadvantage versus the John or Bear in this case. And that power imbalance here is even more exaggerated because of the spell.
On this childish, aloof, and somewhat helpless personality, which plays on Bear and arguably many men's patriarchal tendencies to want to play a man's role for a woman.
Yes, exactly. They want to be a protector, a white knight. If only someone were infantilized to such a degree that I could walk through this checklist of different things that I would have to do to fulfill my cultural value as a man. Damsel in distress, but it's what I call not virgin horse syndrome, but the horse paradox, where someone is the virgin and the horse simultaneously, no matter what you do. And through virgin horse syndrome, as Bear has it, is engaging with the horse paradox in ways where they basically force Nicky through the spell to roleplay and act out this fantasy of the white knight.
To want to feel needed and as if he's doing something important in service to a woman that he's attracted to. And suddenly she needs someone around. She's maybe too intoxicated and doesn't feel safe. Her father is dying and she just needs support. And Bear is clearly on one end incredibly happy to be in this position. His face acting in this scene is really impressive and important. But he also, key phrase here, knows the rules. When you think about modern
Also, what's right and what's wrong.
discourses around gender and dynamics around consent and courtship, for lack of a better way of putting it, there are newer rules for courtship and most importantly consent than when I was growing up. When I was growing up, consent for a man was literally whatever you could get away with.
That's not consent. Like consent is mutual.
Fucking awful, but it's true. There was complete disregard for women's consent to being touched or seen or approached or talked to. And anytime a woman expressed discomfort or a problem around that type of behavior, she was seen as the problem in the equation. She
blaming the whore.
was no fun or approved or bossy or bitchy or whatever. A key feature of patriarchy is that a woman's body doesn't belong to her in the presence of a man. You can't watch 10 movies or TV shows from before 2005 where there isn't a joke or even like not a joke about dubious consent that just kind of flies without any concern in the middle of a show. And you have to start to think, wow, I understand how people like Harvey Weinstein and Diddy and Russell Simmons, etc., got away with shit so much. But that changed in the early 2010s with what is often referred to as fourth wave feminism and Me Too.
Intersectional gender studies, fourth wave feminism sort of anchors it within a gender binary, more broadly, women's rights and equality, but it's generally intersecting with gender studies and sex work and various other things, BDSM, Kinksters, et al. So it's intersectional gender studies is generally how I refer to it, even though it includes feminism. Feminism is something that sits within a larger gender nonconforming umbrella of different voices that are overlapping: trans men, intersex people, trans femmes, trans women, binary, non-binary, what have you.
And I just want y'all to think about the fact that it took 4 waves of feminism before we got to enthusiastic and ongoing consent being important. But one
Yes.
thing about Me Too and its response is that many guys who considered themselves good guys suddenly felt like they were being attacked unfairly for breaking rules that they didn't actually break according to their own logic. They were implicated in ways they weren't exempt from.
And this logic, again, is coming from man box. It's coming from sexism and misogyny. And these are very old forces. The patriarchy is something that dates back to antiquity. It's what I would argue is like the oldest bigotry, or the oldest systemic bigotry, would be patriarchy, tied to older forms of racism or in-group versus out-group exclusion. Are you a Greek or are you a barbarian?
Again, Russell Simmons, Bill Cosby, Weinstein. These were all men that did not fit the usual predator ideology, but were clearly very much predators and in trouble in the media eye.
I would argue that they fit the predator sort of thing because they come from the in-group. Predators is a cartoon, a stereotype, is usually some outsider in a gothic villain kind of way, right? The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, it's a big, tall, scary guy with a knife, a la Scream, but 2 centuries before Scream. Actually, 201 years after Scream. Scream was 1996, and Radcliffe's The Italian was 1797. So basically 2 centuries apart, there's this idea that the rapist is someone who's an outsider, but as Radcliffe herself points out, Scooby-Doo style, or what Scooby-Doo borrowed from Radcliffe as the mother of the Gothic novel, the rapist is generally a member of the in-group. It's a community member, it's a father, it's a husband, it's a preacher, a politician. So when you say, oh, someone doesn't look like an abuser, that's because people are conditioned not to think, vis-a-vis the superstructure, that, oh, there's no way a CEO could be an abuser, the Epstein class. And that's something that my work and the work of other people that I work with are trying to counteract.
But there's a literal clip of Russell Simmons talking about rape being something completely different than what it is for the sake of absolving the behavior that he knows he participated in.
Well, it's a serious word, but I think they've changed the meaning. Oh, so, because I've never been violent to anybody. Rape is a violent crime.
Rape is an abuse of power, and it's something that can occur without physical force. I wasn't forced physically to have sex with my partner when it happened. I didn't want to do it. I was compelled through a financial difference or imbalance in power in ways that were emotionally abusive and exploiting me for every aspect of my labor, from my art to my body to cooking and cleaning. I was a conjugal maid, essentially. And was it physically violent the way that you might conceptualize through a Gothic novel where I was held down and taken against my will? No, it wasn't. But I was still coerced and forced into having sex. That's what
So
rape
it is
is.
very serious. Somebody jumped out of bushes and raped somebody. It's different, I think. So it's a different kind of recollection. I mean, so I don't.
Again, it's a way for this asshole to absolve himself. It's like, oh, I didn't physically jump out of a bush and hold someone down. I don't know his MO. I know with Bill Cosby, for example, he would drug people. Allegedly, Neil deGrasse Tyson supposedly drugged someone that he had slept with while he was in college. So they think, oh, well, I didn't hold them down and take them against their will by force, ergo it must not be rape. So it's a very narrow understanding of rape in ways that let them conveniently, in their mind anyways, wiggle out of it. It's a game for them. You know the rules according to a specific narrow definition. It's easier for you to apologize for it. Oh, I'm not a rapist. Plenty of abusers don't think that what they're doing is rape, at least not openly. But on some level, usually they understand.
I don't think anybody's saying I'm violent. Of course, I've been insensitive.
There's a lot of complaining and hemming and hawing about how seeking consent ruined the mood. And to be fair, this came from both men and women. And to this day, I do think some women struggle with this more than social media likes to admit. For example, if you remember the early days of my first channel, I talked about the dubious consent. Really in this exact same situation in DC's Wonder Woman sequel, where Diana body snatches some poor guy so her ex-boyfriend's soul can inhabit his body for the whole movie. And then there's the first season of Bridgerton where the Duke has his consent and autonomy disregarded. All of this done, of course, by Gen Xer writers who had not really updated their concept of what consent looks like regardless of the gender. And thankfully, this is something that's getting more and more normalized, but
the idea that women can rape men, absolutely. Again, the sexual abuse that I experienced, the emotional, physical, sexual abuse, what have you, generally comes from female parties, not male. Though I was abused by men as well, and they did various things that are kind of parallel to that. but the direct sexual abuse that I experienced in particular generally came from women. And it's important to recognize that women can absolutely be capable of that kind of thing, which generally comes from older forms of feminism saying, oh, women are just victims, or they aren't able to abuse the way that men are. It comes from a very narrow understanding of patriarchy, that only men can be patriarchal, not women, even though the whole point of first and second wave feminism in particular was to basically gain the rights of men and autonomy, including the ability in their minds to basically act like a man, unironically, towards their own prey. And you see that with, for instance, the transsexual empire and various second wave feminist screeds that would victimize their own targets turf style in ways not dissimilar to cishet men or homosexual men.
There are certain people, mostly men that are defending Bear right now, that are still trying to skirt the line, but doing it in a way that I think we haven't started to recognize. And that brings me back to the scene. If you go back and you analyze what Bear does in the scene, on paper, he does everything right. He is passive the entire time, which is his nature, but you can tell both by his performance and based on our knowledge of Bear that he would have liked this night to go slightly differently, but he held himself back. He allows Nicky to take the lead here as to not be able to be blamed for any type of misstep. Nicky is the one who asks to stay. Nicky is the one who asks him to sleep in the bed with her. When Nicky takes off her shirt, Bear immediately turns around, feeling like that will be most appropriate. And when Nicky leans in to kiss him 5 minutes later, he stops and says, wait. Now, he doesn't explicitly ask for consent, but neither does she. So he just goes with the flow until...
What the fuck?
And this line he says here is so important. It's where we get our first hint of Bear's real character.
I'm sorry.
You don't have to be sorry. It's just... Shit, you made me feel like I did something you didn't like.
No.
He doesn't really engage with whether or not she's okay or whether or not something's wrong. He says, you made me feel like I did something wrong.
That's gaslighting, essentially. Oh, I feel like I'm under attack here, even though she's the one who's under the influence of the spell. But he's very quick to defend himself and not reflect on her position at all.
We next see him sleeping on the floor because he doesn't want anything to be misconstrued or cross any lines on paper. And she again, low-key coerces him back into bed before waking up and making a shrine to his dead cat in the morning, which really should have ended the whole fucking movie, but again, whatever. And so this really is like a meta manipulation.
Should it though? Again, we're talking about someone who was responsible for caring for the cat to the point that they basically let the cat die. And Bear doesn't care about the cat. So that's just another sign. This is a huge red flag. Dead cat on the floor is about as red a flag as you can get. Scarlet. And he completely ignores that or apologizes for it to continue his relationship anyways. So this is just another sign that there's something wrong with Bear.
Of us as the audience coming out of this scene, not knowing anything about what happens next and how the movie will eventually take us, we have every reason to see Bear as unlucky, but fundamentally a good guy at this point. He has displayed for us his education on the modern rules of consent and female agency. He has shown himself to be one of the good ones, and this is undeniable, but why and to what end? And to me, that's the really important part, because this reveals the flaw in the way we often address consent and autonomy.
Okay, so I'm curious about this, just what you're going to say, because consent, and specifically the illustration of consent through media and interpreting it as a form of critical thought, was the bedrock of my book series. It was the initial question that I asked myself, Doc Brown style. I was in the kitchen and I had this epiphany where, how do you illustrate consent? How does that work? And for me, that's the context of the media in question as made between workers, where it's literally a part not just of the diegetic sort of framing, but the meta context, if you will. And the same idea illustrating like consent, understanding consent is tremendously important to me. So I'm just curious as to what you're going to say next.
In that it's really still not about seeing a woman's autonomy to be anything more than a man checking a few boxes to protect himself from certain accusations.
It's a form of courtship where when my mom was younger, there was someone who took her out to a movie and dinner. And then my mom at this point was 16, 17, thereabouts. And when they got home, or when he was dropping her off, he said, "Oh, well, you're going to have sex with me, right?" And mom's like, "What? No. Like, that wasn't something that we talked about. We didn't agree to it. I just thought you were taking me out for a movie and dinner." And he's like, "Well, you owe me because I got you a movie and dinner." So again, that idea of courtship, consent is in the eyes of people who operate in ways that don't really value consent, insofar as someone has agency beyond the man doing something. And once he does these things, it could be taking a woman out to dinner, or it could be slaying a dragon. Same idea. Once you walk down that checklist, you put kindness coins into the sex machine until sex comes out. That's essentially what Bear's doing. He's like, I have this idea in my head about what I'm supposed to do. And then once I do it, I'm supposed to get sex. This is a very common, not just incels or nice guys, but just the understanding of courtship more broadly through the man box is essentially what Bear's illustrating. And it's literally just, I'm going to go through these steps. Once I've gone through them and I've done everything correctly, then I can just have sex. And that's what he's doing. And it's less about him deceiving the audience and more him walking through the checklist that most of us already have. Obviously, I knew the context of the story going in, and understanding consent and Gothic poetics and Faustian bargains, I knew that what he was doing was wrong, but I'm also not the target audience of this film, even if you could argue I'm the ideal audience, just because I have this kind of training that's centered around consent, very specifically as mutual. But to the untrained eye, FD Signifier is absolutely 100% correct, insofar as people could look at it and be like, okay, he's done everything right on paper, even though I would argue there's lots of red flags before he even casts the spell. So if people think that, they haven't really been paying attention.
There's a lot of men that say they care about consent and autonomy, but will still coerce women into situations that they don't want to be in.
They care about courtship. They care about rules that make them look like they're not taking a woman by force, but still relying on a system of rules that doesn't really take a woman's agency into consideration. It's not really a part of the equation. It's all about what can the man do to get sex. They want to appear as the white knight, not the black knight, but they're still a knight. They're still an implement of force that enjoys agency that women don't have and aren't favored by a system of courtship. Courtly love is courtly love.
As long as they know that that woman can't return and accuse him of something in the aftermath. And when you look at the often very carceral nature of some elements from fourth wave feminism, the way that Me Too graduated from being something that a black woman brought about to discuss her experiences of sexual violence and turned into a thing where we were just looking for the next man to put on the Summer Jam screen.
And I would argue that, like, fourth wave feminism is, again, that's why I don't call it feminism. It's intersectional, what I call Gothic intersectionality, which is holistic teamwork and play to counteract state predation through Gothic poetics, sex work, BDSM, Ludo-Gothic BDSM, play, Gothic poetics, and BDSM, or the dynamics of power exchange between people more broadly, socially, sexually, what have you. So fourth wave feminism is unto itself already kind of an inadequate term. It is white centric, despite the fact that it's trying to intersect with other groups. It's also not fully there yet. And by the 2010s, when you saw fourth wave feminism, I wouldn't write my book series for about another 10 years. And at that point, I'm trying really hard in 2026 to focus again on holistic teamwork and play to counteract state predation. But that is something that's these things that are being described by Signifier in terms of the Me Too movement are outmoded to a certain extent. Absolutely.
And even in her words, the concept of believe women was being weaponized in ways that she didn't intend it. We see how in some cases,
It's also important to recognize that the word incel actually was produced originally by a lesbian on the internet and was later co-opted by the MGTOW crowd, the manosphere. And it's same idea with the red pill and the blue pill from The Matrix, a film that was made by two trans women and co-opted by the same patriarchal body, essentially.
these things stopped being about actual justice frameworks and started just being recreations of causal systems that exist in all other aspects of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And so instead of a lot of men learning the important lessons they needed to learn to unpack their patriarchal tendencies, they just learned what they could and could not do. And don't get me wrong, that's still probably a good thing. That still probably saved a lot of women from being assaulted and abused in ways they would have been 20, 30 years ago. But I think we all heard that voicemail thing by now.
I guess my thing is like, what would be the point of me coming over then if we're not gonna like hook up and like cuddle and like be intimate with each other? So up to you. Let me know. I'm happy to, if you do want me to come over, I'm happy to do so. Would love to fuck, have a good time.
Like, that is where we're at this point, and it's not quite where we want to go.
Right. The understanding is women, and cis or otherwise, are generally seen as sex objects that you approach for sex. And whether or not you just cut to the chase, the irony being is if people were more upfront and not trying to waste all this time with fake courtship in ways, if I can go through this performance in bad faith, then I can find myself on the receiving end of some pussy. And yet at the same time, if they were just like going and understanding that the person they're talking to is also looking for some sex, for some cock, they could just be like, look, in the words of Rammstein, you have a pussy, I have a dick. What are we waiting for? Let's do it quick. Like, again, if they could just understand who they're talking to and have that direct kind of blunt approach, that can work and respect consent. But they think because they're jumping through these hoops, this courtship ritual in ways that make them look good, but are still coercive at the end of the day. Again, it literally ties to my book series, Sex Positivity versus Sex Coercion, or Gothic Communism, Liberating Sex Work Under Capitalism Through Iconoclastic Art. Like, they think that as long as they don't appear coercive, then they must not be, when that's just not the case.
From that point in the film, things just slowly escalate. Nicky's behavior that night is initially explained as a bad Molly trip, which is important because it again gives Bear and us, the audience, plausible deniability about what his intentions actually are. We might even give him more brownie points for not taking advantage of the girl that maybe was having a bad drug trip. But this dangerous...
Yeah, essentially, if the only thing that happened is Bear made the wish and then had that first night, and then after that, his behavior was completely different than what it was, we would be having a different conversation, if you will, about what his behavior represents. But knowing what we know about him after, and then applying that to his actions, to the wish, to the night in question, and before that even, everything that he does afterwards, once he's tempted by the succubus, betrays who he really is by virtue of his actions.
Adherence to the rules and manipulating of consent comes to a head at the dinner and subsequent sex scene. And this is where the movie stops playing coy and reveals its hand completely.
Yes.
And where the viewer should at this point recognize Bear as a villain. You should recognize that Bear has a full understanding that it was his wish that caused the drastic change in her behavior.
Yes, absolutely.
And he knows at this point that the behavior is weird and damaging and harmful to him and others, but technically it's not against the rules.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The rules don't seem to have a thing in them. I would argue it's almost like an exception, right? Oh, well, this is a unprecedented circumstance where you cast a magic spell. It's still a love potion, right? It's a form of courtship, and it falls within the rules of courtship and lust more broadly. Well, it's just something that once she's underneath the influence of that spell, you can walk her through the courtship rituals like a Stepford wife and basically be like, well, I did everything correctly, because the rules don't really acknowledge love potions. They exist outside of normal order.
The lines that Nicky says right after she sits back down after freaking out the dinner table clarify exactly who Bear really is and what he really cares about, and what key word here, matters.
Then why does it matter?
Does it matter to me?
When Wish Nicky freaks out, she says, why does it matter? They're having a nice date. And then reiterates this after she calms down, and Bear agrees. Why does any of the outside stuff matter to Bear if he gets what he wants and he's not doing anything wrong? And then right after that, we get maybe the first ever sex scene jump scare in film history. And while it's not explicitly stated, at least on camera, this is our first indication that they have had sex. I will hold on to the theory, especially based on the previous montage of them being together, that this is the first time they had been intimate in the entire film. And I can see it also in his reaction in the moment after. He has this stare into...
It kind of reminds me of Eli Roth's Hostel, when the virgin has sex for the first time and he's like staring at the ceiling and, wow, that was so incredible, which is kind of funny to me, because virgins who have sex, the sex is going to be kind of awkward. Like, even if you're working with someone who's a pro, who knows what they're doing, who's a succubus for all intents and purposes, it's still going to be awkward on the recipient's end, because they're going to have difficulty performing probably if they have a penis. And it's not something that you can necessarily force. You can't just rely on the expertise of your partner. They can help put you at ease, but ultimately your body is going to probably betray you to a certain extent. It's just, everyone's first time is usually going to be a little bit awkward, even if one of you isn't a virgin in that situation.
Space as if he's finally accomplished something that he truly desired. He's probably even patting himself on the back for waiting as long as he did, all things considered. It shows how good of a guy he is, that he was showing restraint.
Yeah, exactly. It's a form of virtue in his eyes, an idea of piety, essentially. I waited until this moment, and he probably sees this as like a form of like a nuptial of sorts, or like something that leads up to marriage, where he's doing things the right way, the way that he can be proud of, that potentially his mother can be proud of. I don't know. We never really learn about her, but he thinks that he's doing this so he can show off to his friends that he's in a relationship. Like, this is for social clout. So they call homosocial behavior.
Well, without getting too graphic, this sex scene is depicted in a way for the viewer to not engage with it as consensual sex. This is an assault. This is a horror scene as much as any other in the film, in fact. But it's the only one in which the perpetrator of the horror is Bear and not Nicky.
Yeah, it's very explicitly showing her as a doll. She's dissociating. And that's literally how this spell works. When she is confronted by Bear, it could be seen as a metaphor for dissociation. She's borderline, she dissociates, and he plays the nice guy so that he can have what he wants. And if you have sex with someone and they're dissociating and you don't have any kind of pre-existing agreement, and it's just literally the only kind of negotiating that you're doing that Bear does is when they're dissociating. Like, I dated someone who was borderline, for instance, and they could dissociate, but the important thing is that when we would negotiate, they would very explicitly tell me, there are going to be certain points in time, like we agreed to somno, for instance, having sex with them while they were asleep. And they told me, okay, I'm going to be knocked out, but I consent ahead of time for you to be able to do that. And when they would dissociate, they would tell me, and I'd be like, okay. Whereas none of that communication is happening with Bear. And when the woman is dissociating, he's negotiating with her while she's dissociated, not before into the moment of dissociation.
After this scene, what we should understand as the viewer is that the person experiencing a horror story in this movie isn't Bear, it's Nicky. But because the movie still situates us from Bear's perspective, and because, again, a lot of people don't see how this shit really plays out and don't see the behavior within them that is just as awful as Bear's,
They probably watch the film and say to themselves, oh, well, what's the problem? The guy's getting the girl, right? That's what we're conditioned from an early age to think. From the guy's point of view, get the girl. From the girl's point of view, get the man. You know, reader, I fucked him, basically.
a lot of people don't get that at this point. All that talk about thinking about Bear as being a victim of a toxic relationship, I get why people see that, because I saw that initially. After this scene, what we have to start recognizing is that this is a body horror movie, not a psychological supernatural thriller.
I mean, I would argue that it's kind of multiple things, because a psychological horror film is about demonic possession. Would you make the same argument about The Exorcist? It obviously has psychological components, it has supernatural components. They're not mutually exclusive. They're modular, you know, they can overlap. And I would argue that most body horror films, the Cronenberg in particular, there's a tremendous psychological component. The Fly, the Promethean Quest. So I would hesitate to divide them along discrete lines like that. They're not discrete. They often overlap.
It's the body horror of Nicky being stuck inside herself while her body is being paraded around and abused and raped by a guy who thinks he's not doing anything wrong.
Exactly. Most rapists don't think that what they're doing is wrong, but they also don't think that the person they're with is a person, someone with equal rights, equal agency. Because then courtship as it's presented here wouldn't exist. It would be on equal footing, as opposed to Bear tipping the scales to get what he wants by lobotomizing Nicky.
Bear becomes the undeniable villain at this point because it shows his actual morals and value. But maybe you're still not catching it at this point. Maybe
Yeah, even if he rapes Nicky early on and doesn't fully realize it, eventually he does realize the gravity of what he's done. Even when he's having the conversation with his male friend about the spell, and he thinks that, oh, it could be a Molly trip, maybe he does think that, you know, but there's a certain point when it becomes undeniable that he has access to someone that is under his power. It's not just a courtship thing. It's not just him going through the motions, but he well and truly understands. And I agree. That is the moment where he becomes not just the rapist, but the villain outright. Because rape and villainy, unfortunately, in the Gothic, they don't have to go hand in hand. You can accidentally abuse someone without being the cartoonishly evil Gothic villain. That is entirely possible, regardless of sex, gender, or race.
you still are trying to argue that he's just a flawed guy that found himself in a crazy situation that he couldn't have imagined and is suffering in ways that he doesn't deserve. Again, I do think the movie intentionally muddies these waters by having a scene not long after that be Bear at the party with Nicky acting completely erratic. And
I thought that was a scene where she's torturing him, right? It's death by social awkwardness. Honestly, I see this as a moment where she's seduced him, she's convinced him to have sex with her. So now she has him on the hip because he has done something he knows is wrong, and she can basically sort of insinuate in front of his friends she's humiliating him on purpose.
because we're situated from his perspective, we're thinking about how that feels to be the person whose partner is acting erratic and toxic in public.
In my case, no, I identified with Nicky. I'm like, yeah, you raped me? Well, now I'm going to let everyone fucking know. Granted, they do it in this way that demonizes mental illness and abuse victims. Like, again, this isn't a perfect film because it's working within Gothic language. And I would argue that the Gothic more broadly, unless they just have an aside with the audience where they break the fourth wall and say, and this is where I totally expose him to his friends, wink, like something like that, like something out of a Shakespearean play. And they don't do that. And I would argue that had they done that, it would have eliminated the ambiguity instead of just relying on the audience vis-a-vis Mary Shelley's Frankenstein within an ambiguous dialogue to make the right choice. Sometimes you really do have to break the fourth wall and just say, look, this is what this means. And I think that that's important to a certain extent. And to the film's detriment, it doesn't try a little bit harder at doing. Like, you can still have the test in terms of, do people know what rape is or isn't, while having someone instruct it in a more vocal way. And the movie doesn't, because Signifier is interpreting the scene and saying, I identified with Bear, or I felt what Bear felt. And I'm like, no, I felt what Nicky felt. It's like, yeah, Nicky, be awkward and weird. She's testifying to her own rape.
And you have to manage their behavior, but you have to understand at this point, especially because he lies about it right before, that Bear has knowingly signed up for these problems and understands that he has caused them. But if there's any doubt left for the late adopters, it should be gone after he tries to sneak out to see the other girl, and we hear real Nicky for the first time in a while begging him to kill her.
Bear,
Yes.
I'm just getting water.
At this point, it's important to recognize that he's holding her prisoner and he understands the ins and outs of the game, who has power and who doesn't.
kill me, please.
What?
She's sleeping. It's me.
You are you, Nicky. So bad about being with me.
So here she lets us know that there are actually two.
What's so bad about being with me? Why can't you just be happy? This is coercion. This is him basically arguing with her to stay with him, to try and love him. So again, this is the kind of shit that my partner would pull. At the my ex, but Lindsay, when I was in Florida, my rapist would pull this kind of shit.
Nicky's by saying that she's sleeping, it's me, the real Nicky. And Bear takes a moment, and I love how we hold on this scene of him as he runs the calculus through his head and then just says, nah, you're the real Nicky. Stop all that bullshit, girl. Stop being crazy. You're Nicky. And this is gaslighting. This is Bear telling Nicky that the abuse and assault that she's suffering isn't real and is low-key her fault. The magic may have caused this to happen, but it's still her regardless, so she has no right to see what he's doing as wrong in any way. It's him affirming, just like he did in the earlier scene, that he hasn't broken any rules despite the reality of what's happened. Even if you don't catch that subtle message, which, like everything else in the scene, isn't subtle, but whatever.
Yeah, it's not exactly a subtle scene.
You know from this scene and from the previous scenes that Bear knows the totality of what he is doing, and he's still just pushing through, disregarding the damage that is causing.
And I would argue that, like, per the Faustian bargain, there's this lead up to midnight or the climatic event where things go super badly wrong. This is his last chance to back out, and there's the devil on his shoulder and the angel on his shoulder, Faust and Mephistopheles. And the devil in this is Curry Barker on the phone. Maybe you should kill yourself. Mephistopheles is Dark Nicky, and Faust in this case is Bear. And the moment that he has to basically disengage is when Nicky, she could be seen as the angel, but also his friend. You know, again, this psychomachy, this battle of wills, of the mind, of duality. It's not, again, you could assign different characters a similar position within the story, but in any event, like, he has these moments where, like, his friend, his Asian friend is telling him, look, something's not right. And Nicky, real Nicky, as opposed to the succubus, is also trying to tell him the same thing. So within the Faustian bargain, a continued ignoring of the angel in furtherance to the devil is an ongoing Faustian trope. So this is like the moment before the crossing of the Rubicon when the shit really hits the fan.
Until Nicky commits her first murder. But even after that, he's low-key still trying to avoid accountability, still trying to figure out how to undo his damage as opposed to restore it and be accountable for it. I get this from the final scene between Bear and Ian. And initially I was kind of annoyed by this scene because I felt like the movie was kind of padding and shuffling its feet to give itself an excuse for this situation to not effectively resolve the plot. All Bear had to do was calmly say, hey, Ian, I fucked up. I made a wish that made Nicky love me, but it fucked her up. You need to make a wish and you only get one. I need you to wish her back to normal. But instead, he does all this hemming and hawing, mentioning their previous relationship, trying to misdirect before saying,
I need you to wish that I never made a wish. Okay? And then you can be with Nicky.
and that's a really different statement than saying, I want Nicky to be back to normal. And I get it. If there's a version of a wish that could undo what he's done, maybe that means that Sarah is still alive. And obviously it means that the aftermath of all this damage could be undone, but it still does have the added benefit of absolving him of any responsibility and allowing for him to maintain the psychological disposition that he's done nothing wrong.
Again, vis-a-vis Matthew Lewis as the monk, Ambrosio is someone within a position of authority, the false preacher, who enjoys the benefits as the black penitent, the confessor, who wants to be able to say that he's holy, that he's good, when behind that veneer, he's up to no good, and he's constantly finding ways to abuse the trust of others around him while still maintaining that facade of piety. So that's essentially what's happening here. Again, the monk is a story that's over 200 years old at this point. And it was a story that was largely echoed in Obsession, because the whole point of Ambrosio is he falls in love with a woman, that he makes a deal with the devil, essentially, though in that case, the devil is occupying the body of a woman, supposedly, that is not inside the body of the woman that he falls in love with, whereas morphologically, in Obsession, Curry Barker and company basically combine Matilda and Antonia, I think the woman's name was, could get the name of the gothic heroine wrong, but the idea that they're kind of combining certain characters, but it's the same basic dilemma.
And of course, we know that's not what happens. Ian wishes for $1 billion, then gets shot by Nicky, who's going like full exorcist mode at this point.
Yeah, this is Hamlet, right? This is the revelation in The Monk, where Ambrosio is revealed to be a dickwad. He's at every chance under the sun, including with the wish with his friend to be able to come clean. He continually refuses to and hoists himself in his own petard, at which point the succubus has the horror's revenge. You fucked me over and over and over, and guess what? Real Nicky told me what you did, so now I am going to glut the maw of death with your friends and make you watch and torture you until you commit suicide. That's, so as far as that goes, this is a classic sort of comeuppance within this kind of theater, from Shakespeare to Webster and various other authors going forwards into the present day. So this is just a very old tradition where the secret dickwad, Claudius from Hamlet, for example, is exposed to be false and gutted for it.
Bear finally resigns to killing himself before chickening out, but not before Nicky makes her own wish, which eventually sets her free. And while in my head canon, Nicky takes the $1 billion and runs or whatever, she probably does actually spend the rest of her life in jail and is labeled a crazy girl whose jealous love cost 3 innocent young people their lives or something. It's pretty fucked up. Really?
Yeah, that's probably what happens. And they probably erect a monument in Bear's honor or something stupid like that.
You have to give credit to the film, because I can't think of a legit moment in any movie I've ever watched where you're frustrated that the main character is not committing suicide. So bravo to Barker Curry.
Curry Barker.
Bravo to Curry Barker. Bravo to Curry Barker. Fuck. To wrap up, Just like how victimhood shouldn't require someone to be perfectly innocent.
Imagine making a movie and then someone can't remember your name. It's like, ah, yes, the author of Frankenstein, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron.
Bear does not have to be perfectly evil in order for us to recognize his abusive and predatory tendencies.
Exactly. Again, Ari, there's no such thing as a perfect abuser because oftentimes rape happens in ways that aren't just cartoonishly evil. You're not dating a James Bond villain. You're dating someone who is unto themselves coded by society in ways where they have all these rules that they follow. They think if they follow them, that they're not bad. And to a certain extent, philosophically, that's kind of how morality works, right? Morality is determined by codified behaviors within society that in a Gothic story serve as camouflage, if you will. And it becomes almost a fruitless exercise to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what exactly the contents were inside Bear's head from beginning to end. Certainly after, partway through the film, it becomes pretty fucking obvious. But when he made the wish and the first night or thereabouts, the first date when they're having dinner, there's no way to really know exactly what's going on in his head. But then he proves it ipso facto.
And more importantly, to begin to recognize that these predatory tendencies are far more common than many of us would like to think.
Exactly. This isn't addressing a fringe behavior. This is a commonplace action that happens among men who, when they look at Bear, they're doing the same thing he's doing. They're like, oh, that's not me. I'm going to defend Bear because I see myself in Bear, instead of saying, you know what, Bear fucked up. You get so much more pussy, guys, if you just owned up, took responsibility, and recognized a woman's right and ability to consent, and then worked with them, learn their boundaries, learn what they like, just to have a back and forth conversation. Next thing you know, you're going to be balls deep in some baddie. Okay. It's not super hard. I'm not saying go about it like with that mindset. Go about it because they're a person and you respect their right to consent. And then good things will follow as a result of that. But at the end of the day, as someone who has been doing this a long time and has worked with over 100 sex workers, friends, artists, models, muses, you name it, it works. Okay. And if you want to get laid, there's no shame in saying, I want to get laid and I'm going to do it in an ethical way that respects the rights of both parties to consent mutually. That is a perfectly valid thing to do, and there's no shame in it. But shame and the feeling like we have to hide our desires while working through a system, paradoxically, that puts a woman on a conveyor belt towards our dicks, okay, it's better not to have shame and to operate honestly with other people in ways that uphold consent for all and can pass that message along.
And I think the flaws in the discourse around this movie that I have seen is that so many people still haven't unpacked their patriarchal frameworks and their carceral low-key white supremacist frameworks of who is deserving and undeserving of punishment or victimhood.
The imprisonment of women is something that can affect people of different races. Black Snake Moan, for example, is a story about a black guy who chains a white girl to a radiator to help her, admittedly, in that story. But this idea that there can be racial animus between black men and white women, for instance. My mother was raped by a black man who she was friends with. She was homeless. He let her stay at his place, and they were together for a year before one day, despite them having slept together multiple times, he raped her. So white supremacy and that carceral mentality about who deserves punishment includes black men and their treatment of some white women. It's admittedly sort of a marginal example on the fringes, but it does happen. And it goes to show that these kinds of systems affect different people differently, anisotropically. But sexism and misogyny, even though rape is more commonly intra-racial within a racial group, it can happen interracially as well. So this kind of thing, just because something ties to white supremacy doesn't mean that black men can't rape white women. They absolutely can. Black men can be transphobic, but also trans people can be racist as well. And even though it seems like it would be harder to do, I could envision, at least, theoretically, a trans person could be bigoted or racist towards a trans man and rape them. At the very least, call the cops on them. When I was in Florida, Lindsay wanted to call the cops on our black neighbors. That is a form of power abuse that can lead directly to someone's death in ways that are not dissimilar to rape, which is ultimately about an abuse of power tied to systemic structures. As you say, white supremacy.
Patriarchy wants us to imagine toxic, abusive, and predatory men to be these evil figures with obvious signs of dysfunction. We like to pretend that those types of men are so clearly different from us, but the truth is that patriarchy does a good job of making their behavior seem normal to everyone. Maybe.
Well, the irony being, though, is that Bear's closest friends said that he was a creepy weirdo at the very start of the film. So that sense of normality is largely coming from the audience, because at the start of the film, they're like, no, man, that's creepy and weird. Why would you do that? So it kind of acknowledges that he's a friggin' weirdo from the start. And the people who are normalizing this are bringing it with them into the film. They know the rules.
Even appropriate, and it has done this forever, and all of us are closer to this type of wickedness than we like to think. The reason why Bear is getting so much grace from a lot of men is because a lot of men are like Bear. And
Fucking oath. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
And they can't quite see the problem of his behavior. And paradoxically, that's also why we need to be less bombastic about our criticism, because people struggle to see themselves as evil. Because people aren't. Like, it's just the reality. Most people aren't evil like that. Bear is no Diddy, no Weinstein, no Russell Simmons or whatever. But most men who harm women are not Diddy or Weinstein or Russell Simmons. And
no, they're just ordinary men, but they still have relative privilege that gives them, for all intents and purposes, a similar degree of grace and power, where people are bending over backwards for Bear, despite the fact that he's not Weinstein, with a similar degree of reverence. They're dying on that hill.
That most men are a lot like Bear. And it's that false dichotomy that allows the Bears of the world to move on without being accountable for how their behavior is affecting others and not even recognizing that they need to be accountable for anything in the first place. I actually think Obsession would be a good movie for like a men's circle, to have a bunch of men come together and talk about how they
like a reading, like a book group or something. It's like, okay, guys, today we're going to learn how to be nice to women, kind of like the sharks in Finding Nemo. Fish are friends, not food.
Felt about that character's behavior so they can unpack ways in which they may or may not recognize how the behavior is a problem. I think men having more candid conversations around gender is a good thing. And it's something that I actually did a little while ago that ended up being a part of the second episode of Goon World. For those who don't know, Goon World is my Nebula original that is a deep dive into the various aspects of pornography, sex, and sex work. And the second episode looks at the complicated world of porn usage for men.
I will say, FD, if you ever want to have me on for a candid conversation with a trans sex worker who focuses on basically intersections of class, culture, and race between gender nonconforming people, non-white people, BIPOC people more broadly, and various other struggles, I'm here.
Topic that every male watching this likely knows something about, but nobody wants to talk about with any sense of honesty or sincerity.
I do.
Or worse yet, the only men openly talking about pornography use being kind of a problem for them are, I don't want to say weirdos, but weirdos in like no-fap communities or hyper-religious right-wing organizations. So as a part,
they're treating it like it's a disease to diagnose or a sin, essentially. They're not having a healthy conversation about it. It's a antagonistic conversation. It's something for them to pray away or otherwise exercise.
Part of this episode, I brought together a few guys along with actual experts, which included sex workers and sexologists, to discuss the controversy.
Hey, Sinead, I've worked with them. Nice. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Versatile topic of porn addiction. And I use air quotes there for a reason, but you won't understand that reason until you see the video itself. But because Goon World is a video on a topic that YouTube does not like to monetize, That video is only going to be accessible via my streaming service Nebula, who also sponsored this video. More on that after the drop.
Nebula is an independent streaming service.
Okay, so yeah, that's essentially the video. And yeah, this is generally speaking a pretty good take on obsession. It definitely clarified some things that I felt were a little bit lacking initially. And I get it, you know, you have other things going on, but it just goes to show that you're kind of like the things that you were addressing off the cuff in that video, you were able to return to here and explain in a way that I agreed with much more readily. And it was less, this video and me responding to you was less about me disagreeing with you and just kind of supplementing what you were saying in a way that I just sort of agreed with a priori. So yeah, and it's cool that your Goon World series, and as far as all of that goes, has different people on that I've worked with before, and I think that that's pretty neat. You're obviously, you know, trying very hard to invite other people into the conversation. And yeah, this is just all around a very good follow-up to the initial video. And I appreciate, though I haven't seen your Goon World series, it's kind of a weird title and not super partial to that, but that's whatever. You know, it's like not the title I would have gone with personally, but I haven't had a chance to see it because it's on Nebula, but I would be interested in giving it a closer look and also just having a conversation with you candidly as a part of my aforementioned book volume, where I talk about intersectionality and sex work, sex workers, non-sex workers. This would be something that I would be down to doing. But in any event, I'm going to cut the video off there. Thanks for making it, FD. On your end, I appreciated it. And until next time, stay tuned for more and stay safe out there.